On a hike some time ago, I found myself enlisted on an unintended hunting expedition. Well, hunting overstates it a bit. But there was a sign at the trailhead that led up to the mountains asking hikers to note any sightings of a particular butterfly and take pictures of it if possible. But because of the sign, I was far more aware of the many different butterflies that were flying around. Normally, my mind would simply register that I had seen a butterfly, and unless it was particularly striking, I probably wouldn't even notice it beyond that. But on this trip, because of my focused attention, I noticed all the various kinds of butterflies fluttering from flower to flower, tree to tree. I was amazed. Have you ever considered how much of the world we miss simply because we don't pay attention to it? Nature is so full of wonderful things, just waiting for us to pay attention. I think this is one of the reasons parents, teachers, Sunday schools like to place caterpillars in jars or other see-through containers and show them to children so that they may watch the process, this awe-inspiring process. When you consider it for a moment, it's no wonder that the transformation of a caterpillar into a butterfly has long been used by poets and mystics as a metaphor for the internal transformation of human development, especially human spiritual development. Now, since time immemorial, people have been using this example because it really seems quite miraculous, magical, that a worm-like creature constructs this outer casing and then later emerges as a butterfly with wings, colors and shapes that didn't exist before. And even now, as science helps us better understand what's happening within the cocoon, it's just as magical. And the more we learn about the process, I find the metaphor is even stronger in its relationship to spiritual development. Because before, from the outside, given that the metamorphosis is hidden behind the walls of the cocoon, it all seems relatively effortless, magical. And some people think this is how spirituality works. Some miraculous, unseen shift simply transforms us, and we suddenly gain greater awareness, and we're more compassionate, and boom, it's done. But now we know better. You see, after that caterpillar spins its cocoon, the would-be butterfly almost completely dissolves into formless, shapeless goo. And this goo is the raw material from which the butterfly will be born. The goo is actually the remains of the caterpillar. The brain, the heart, the digestive system, they're all gone. The raw materials that the only remaining cells, the imaginal cells, that these cells will use to build the butterfly. One writer described the process like this. He said, "At first, these imaginal cells, the seeds of future potential, which contain the blueprint of a flying creature, operate independently as single-cell organisms. They are regarded as threats and are attacked by the caterpillar's immune system. But they persist, multiply, and connect with each other. The imaginal cells form clusters and clumps, begin resonating at the same frequency and passing information back and forth until they hit a tipping point where they begin acting not as discrete individual cells but as multi-cell organisms, and then the butterfly is born. And if that isn't incredible enough, consider that when the butterfly emerges, in spite of it being totally dissolved and reconstructed, it carries the memories of the caterpillar. Scientific studies have shown that when caterpillars have been exposed to negative stimuli, the butterflies they become remember and avoid those same stimuli. Remember, the brain's gone. It's dissolved. If the caterpillar could think, if it could reason out the process that it would be subjected to in order to become a butterfly, do you think it would do it? Would it go forth willingly by choice to become a butterfly, knowing everything that would happen to it? Would you? But caterpillars don't have a choice. They respond only to predetermined stimuli. Those imaginal cells force it. When the conditions are right and when they kick in, it forces the shift. They go from eating machines to pollinators. It is much the same for each of us, growing up anyway. We don't choose to learn to walk. We didn't say, I'm going to walk today. I'm going to learn to talk today. I'm going to learn to think rationally today. Now, I know none of us chose puberty. I got to do what? What's going to happen to my body? I don't know about that. All these changes happen to us because that's the way we've evolved. But does this process end just because we've reached the somehow magical age of 18 and we become adults? Is it safe to assume that just because our bodies reach full maturity that our consciousness, our awareness does as well? See, my way of thinking about spiritual development is voluntary maturation. A process we choose to a certain degree to direct in a certain direction. I want to be this kind of person, so I do these types of things. I want to be more aware, so I meditate. I want to be more compassionate. I want to do these things, and so I do these things. Conscious maturation. Now, as far as we know, none of us were given much of a choice when we were born. We didn't get to choose what culture we would be born into, what point in history. We didn't choose our parents, our siblings, the color of our skin, our sexuality, our gender, etc., etc., etc. We didn't choose any of this. We were born into a story already in progress, and we were assigned a role in that story without our input or consent. I have a friend, well, it was an acquaintance, years ago, and he had a significant impact on my life. He was born into a situation he didn't choose. Well, let me just tell this story. I met him back when I was younger, in my wilder days, when I spent most weekend nights in a bar or pool hall. Hard to imagine looking at me now, I know. And one establishment that I spent far too much time and money in had a house band that played mostly country and older rock songs, and I often bought members of the band drinks, and one of them more drinks than anybody else. That was Daryl. It wasn't that I liked Daryl any more than the rest, it's just that he drank more. So one day I was at this bar. The band wasn't playing. It was probably a weekday, and Daryl was there. So I sat down next to him at the bar, and I bought him a beer, and we started talking. Like I said, we weren't really friends. Relationship had never really grown beyond, buying a drink and a little bit of small talk about the music and the crowd. But on this particular night, Daryl, already several beers ahead of me, wanted to talk, and he wanted to talk about himself. He wanted to tell me his story. So I listened. He said, my parents were classically trained musicians. My father played in a jazz band, and my mother taught music at Columbia. Daryl was in his 40s or so at the time. Large man, larger than me. Scraggly beard and wore a trucker's cap. He looked at me at this point, I think gauging whether I believe him or not. So I said, in New York? He said, yeah, in New York. And he continued his story. He said, my parents were musicians, and no one seemed too surprised when I was 4 years old and asked if I could play the piano. I'd always been told not to touch it. So I never did. My parents assumed that I was asking to take lessons to learn how to play the piano. So they said yes, I could play the piano. I was 4 years old, though, he said, so I was more direct. After dinner, I excused myself and went to the piano, and I started playing the piano. I had no idea what I was playing at the time, but my parents say it was a near-perfect replication of the concerto my mother had been practicing. I was a prodigy, he said. That's what they told me, over and over again. They loved to show me off to their friends and colleagues. They bought me child-sized violin not long after that, and I quickly learned to play that. I was especially adept at string instruments, he said. And the more attention I received, the more I played. I was 4 years old. That's what a 4-year-old does. I can tell that he'd told this story before, oftentimes probably in his own head. Daryl was given all the best tutors, music teachers, and I was assured that I had the most promising music careers ahead of me. I was a gift. I had a gift and I needed to share it. And they said I could do anything I wanted with this gift. I could write my own ticket. And he downed another beer, called for another. Said I spent my entire life learning to play music, nothing but music. I didn't know anybody hardly that wasn't a musician. I wanted to do other things. I tried to do other things, but my parents, my teachers, the world all told me that that would be a waste of my terrible gift, my wonderful gift. And he looked at me and said, "Do you know what I loved to do in school? You know what my favorite subject was?" Now, thinking back to when I was in high school, what I wanted to do in school, my favorite interests were, cars and girls. But he said, what I loved was math. I loved math more than anything, more than the music. And my math tutor insisted that I was a gifted mathematician. And she was the only adult in my life who assured me that I could be anything other than a musician. And that gave me hope. That maybe I could write my own ticket. That I could be in charge of my own life. But I made the mistake of telling my parents that. And they fired that tutor, he said. Downing that umpteenth beer, he said, that's when I started doing drugs, started drinking. He said my first stint at rehab was just about a year later. I knew he told this story before. You know the hardest part of it all, he said? It was how they would talk about me as though I wasn't even there. For some reason, when you're labeled a prodigy, you become invisible and your feelings no longer matter. He said, don't get me wrong, I love music, I still do. I still play to make a living. But my passion was always numbers. And when I was playing, it wasn't musical notes I saw in my head. It was numbers, a composition of complex mathematical equations. He looked at his watch. People had watches back then. Said he had to go, and he asked for his check. I was left with my beer and my thoughts. Oh, that's me. It was then that I first realized how lucky I was to be so exceedingly average. I was in my early 20s, still not clear what I wanted to be when I grew up. Realizing for the first time just how fortunate I was to have the freedom to figure that out for myself. Being a white, male, straight person, I had choices. Daryl, because of his circumstances, ones he did not choose, he was forced into a life that was not his own. His body matured naturally, but his consciousness, his spirit, his soul, who he was born to be, it was stunted at an early age. He did not experience all the routine problems of growing up. He was not allowed to be a child, to be with other children. He was sheltered from all the struggles of figuring out who we are and how we interact with each other. What kind of person am I? Am I the kind of person who helps somebody else out when they're in need? Do I defend the defenseless? Or am I a bully? He wasn't given that choice. The drugs and alcohol then serve to block further development as an adult. So he was stunted. Author Paulo Coelho tells the story of a man that spent hours watching a butterfly struggling to emerge from its cocoon. It made a small hole, but its body was too large to fit through the hole. And after a long struggle, it appeared to be exhausted and remained absolutely still. So the man decided he's going to help out. With a little knife, he opened up the cocoon, giving plenty of space for the would-be butterfly to emerge. But the butterfly's body was enlarged, its wings deflated. Nothing happened as it got out. It just tried to walk around with this swollen body. The man, out of his kindness, out of his eagerness to help, it failed to understand was that struggle out of the cocoon, like our struggle through childhood, through life, shapes that butterfly and gives it the tools it needs. It pushes the moisture out of the body into the wings. It needs that struggle to fly. Nature's way of making it all happen. This is not to say that all of our difficulty in life was put there to teach us a lesson. It's not to say that all suffering is given to us for the exclusive reason to train us. Because that sounds an awful lot like some cruel and wicked God controlling us like a puppet on a string. But however, since struggle is a part of life, it's part of life, it's part of living, because pain and suffering are so common, it's in our own best interest to consider the potential good that can result from struggle, acting as though they have meaning, as to make them meaningful. This is the truth behind the idea that the meaning of life is to give life meaning. This is our choice, to give meaning to the meaningless, the pointless. Stuff happens. Sometimes we call it grace. And sometimes we just say shit happens. But that's just a matter of perspective. Because as we know, they often get reversed. What seems like grace turns out bad, and vice versa. We all want life to be smooth and easy and wonderful, but really life is all about the goo. It's about the struggle to find truth in the midst of chaos. And it is from the truth, the deepest and most profound truth that we call spirit of life, the divine spark. When we find that truth, it acts like those imaginal cells and sets us on a path to reaching our fullest potential. But unlike the butterfly, however, that transformation is ongoing. Our struggle is ongoing. It's not a one-time event. We don't get to wrap ourselves in a cocoon and emerge completed. The spiritual life, the life that sees renewal and rebirth as a real and ongoing pursuit, requires of us a certain degree of vigilance. It's an ongoing, lifelong process. For once we believe ourselves to reach our highest potential, once we think we're there, that we've made it, let us be assured that that is the ego saying this, just another barrier in our responsible search for truth and meaning. We are never there. None of us are ever done. And one more thing on this. And this is so often the case that everything I'm talking about here, which we experience as individuals, it's also true for communities of individuals. True for congregations, cities, states, and countries. About this phenomenon, spiritual teachers might say, as above, so below, as without, so within, or something equally esoteric. But a mathematician or a scientist might recognize it as fractal relationships. What I see happening in this country now, how all this translates, is all this chaos, this fear, this worry we experience now, that is an invitation to create something new. That is the body trying to reject the imaginal cells. And so, let us look for those points of truth and light that exist in the world and join with them to be an imaginal cell from which a new reality can emerge. This congregation has the potential to be one of those imaginal cells. The Poor People's Campaign, Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, the women's marches. These are imaginal cells, calling us forward into a new, more holistic reality. This is the hope of the future. Not in resisting the past, but creating the future. And it begins with each of us finding the truth in our own being and sharing it with others. Because if we're not in touch with our own truth, how can we be authentic in community with others searching for truth and meaning as well? So be it. Amen. Blessed be.